I want you all to now pay attention to this very special virtual town hall that we have arranged with the Foreign Minister of India. He tried very hard to be with us, but democracy has its own tunes and he has to remain in the capital. But we will try and quiz him and seek guidance and responses from him on some of the matters that we have discussed in the past days. This is the flow of this evening. I will first request Ambassador Susan Chenoy to open this evening and introduce our special speaker and the Foreign Minister, after which he will be in a conversation. I will pose a few questions to him and then bring some of you who have already been identified into this conversation. And if there is still some time left, our Foreign Minister likes the curveball, and we will try and bring a couple of you into this conversation as well. So let's race against the clock and try to make this as inclusive as possible in the spirit of the G20, the Indian G20, the Indonesia G20, and of course the commitments made by Brazil and South Africa to take this ethic forward. So may I now request Ambassador Susan Chenoy to open this evening and introduce our special guest. Ambassador Chenoy.
Honorable Minister Dr. S. Jaishankar, ladies and gentlemen, namaskar, good evening. It's a privilege for me to stand before you this evening as the chair of the Think 20 core group of India's G20 presidency, and to deliver the introductory remarks preceding the ministerial address. Over the past 2 days, we have gathered here in Mysuru, for the Think 20 Summit. Its success is testimony to the myriad contributions made by more than 130 members from 125 institutions from not only G20 countries, but from countries and nations around the world. The inclusive nature of India's G20 presidency and that of Think 20 India is in keeping with Prime Minister Narendra Modi's vision of leaving none behind. And that is also the G20 motto: one earth, one family, one future. Ladies and gentlemen, over the past 8 months, India has held nearly 180 events in over 56 destinations across the length and breadth of the country. The success of Think 20 India has much to do with the enormous support provided by the G20 Secretariat in the Ministry of External Affairs, led by the Sherpa, and especially the guidance and direction provided by Dr. S. Jaishankar, the Honorable External Affairs Minister of India. This evening, we are all expectantly gathered here to listen to the ministerial address, albeit online, about to be delivered by Dr. S. Jaishankar. And I have the singular honor to welcome and to introduce the dignitary, if that were really possible. Frankly, Dr. S. Jaishankar needs no introduction, whether in India or on the international stage. In any case, it would be extremely difficult to try and put in a nutshell his very long and distinguished career, as also his numerous achievements. Suffice it for me to state this evening that Dr. S. Jaishankar is a remarkable leader who straddles India's external engagements like a colossus. He is the only individual since independence to have headed the Indian Foreign Service, first as Foreign Secretary, and then to have been elevated to the high position of Foreign Minister in the same ministry. Today, Dr. S. Jaishankar is a key architect of India's robust and proactive foreign policy under the leadership of Prime Minister Narendra Modi. Over the past 4 years, he has translated India's foreign policy goals and objectives into concrete action, whether in promoting India's sovereign interests, pursuing India's neighborhood first policy, or scoping new and strategic partnerships with countries ranging from those in Africa and Latin America, as also with major powers. His understanding of India's domestic landscape, and especially his ability to reach out to India's youth and to articulate their aspirations, is well known. He has also given new meaning to the growing interconnectedness between the internal and the external, as India's rise takes place in the global arena as a major economic power and as a voice for the global South. There are many quotes that I could borrow from Dr. S. Jaishankar's speeches and writings. But the one most relevant to the G20 and to the Think 20 is his observation that the G20 is not the UN Security Council. It is not the primary forum to debate international peace and security. And as he has rightly stated, India has nudged the G20 to look at the core issues that really matter to the vast majority of nations. Issues such as SDGs, climate finance, gender equality, as well as health, education, and skilling. Ladies and gentlemen, in a polarized world, Dr. Jaishankar has pointed out that the G20 is really an opportunity for all of us to demonstrate solidarity on developmental issues. As he has stated, the decisions that we make today have the potential to contribute to an inclusive, sustainable, and resilient future for all of us. Ladies and gentlemen, it would be true to say that India has taken the lead in pushing for collective action, including in the G20, at an important juncture and a very critical turning point in international relations. With these few words, I now invite Dr. S. Jaishankar, the Honorable External Affairs Minister of India, to kindly share his thoughts with us, particularly on how we can all come together to build a better and secure future for all. After that, the Minister will be in a conversation with Dr. Samir Saran, and there will be a chance for all of you to engage the Minister as well. The floor is yours, Minister Jaishankar. Thank you, sir, for joining us today. Namaskar. Good evening.
Namaskar. And Ambassador Chinoy, I thank you for a very generous introduction. Samir, always good to see you. And I must say at the outset that I too am more than a little disappointed that I cannot be with you physically. The think tanker in me wanted to be there, but the minister in me had to be in Parliament. So I think you can all understand which way the outcome went. But really, once again, my greetings, my good wishes to all of you. I'm so glad that you're visiting Mysuru. It's a place with which I myself, earlier in my life, have had some association, and I hope you do make the best of your stay. It's a great place. Now, let me say a few words about the G20 in a way from a T20 perspective. I think this is an occasion at this point of time. We are about a month away, a little more than a month away from the summit. And if I were to pick perhaps 4 points which I think are important at this moment, one would be really to highlight the importance of getting the G20 right, because the value of the G20 in today's international relations is really huge. I mean, it is all said and done the premier international gathering, and what we need to do is to ensure that it focuses on the right issues, and most important, after all the debates and discussions, that it comes up with an actionable consensus. So I would say that to me right now is the primary thought when I look at the G20. Now, the second point for your consideration is, you would all be familiar with this, which is really that the journey from the G7 to the G20 in many ways symbolizes the transformation of our era. It's a kind of rebalancing that the realization that the G7 by itself will not be sufficiently influential to deal with key global issues, that you needed a bigger buy-in. And you all know this was an outcome of the global financial crisis, 2008, 2009. But I highlight the G7, G20 point also to underline that it's important that the G20 remain unified. That while there is a G7 within the G20, nevertheless, it's crucial that when it comes to the global challenges, we act like the G20, and that there is a open discussion among all members. I mean, whatever their other affiliations, to create really a unified approach to the crucial issues. The third point, and I think Ambassador Chenoy in a way anticipated me here by saying that the G20 is not the UN Security Council, but I make the point that the gridlock today in the UN Security Council and the UN system actually makes the G20 even more important than it would be otherwise. So that is not to say, I mean, peace and security issues have its place, but if you look in terms of overall global welfare, global good, I think the responsibilities on the G20 are perhaps a little bit heavier, precisely because today the UN Security Council finds itself in a way polarized and unable to come to a consensus on many, many issues. And my fourth point is, of course, a reminder of what is the mandate of the G20. And the mandate of the G20 is development and growth. And I make that point not because you are all unaware of it, you are, of course, extremely sensitive to it, but because if there is something today which is really under stress, it is development and growth. That large parts of the world today are following G20, they have a stake in G20, they would like to influence G20, the countries outside the room, outside the table, and that is because they find their development and their growth today under jeopardy. And they would like G20 to do something about this. Now, having said that, I look at the world today, and obviously it's not an easy place. But if I were to, in a way, conceptually describe it, I would say the two big problems are, on the one hand, East-West divide, and on the other hand, a North-South gulf. And the two are not unrelated in a way to each other. Now, it's important for the G20, for the T20, that each of these is addressed, and that the two problems which have to some degree an interplay, that both of them are harmonized. And I think that's really quite a challenge, certainly a challenge for diplomacy, but I would argue even in the intellectual world, I think the East-West connect, the East-West today friction, I would say, and the North-South gaps. Now, in terms of the issues today before the G20, nothing I say would really be a surprise to you people. I mean, clearly, there are very deep concerns about fuel, about food, about fertilizers, concerns about, and a lot of these directly emanate from the Ukraine conflict. There are pre-existing concerns about the impact of COVID, not just on health, but impact of COVID on development, on resources, on debt, on disruptions, even on governance. And then there's the pre-existing, which is issues like debt and trade, which have got aggravated partly because of COVID, but also because of the Ukraine conflict. And then how does this all play out on two very, very crucial issues for not just countries, but really for the future of the planet, which is the SDG, whose achievement today is clearly under stress, and climate action. That, if you are looking at a world where the problems are getting bigger, but the resources are getting more stressed, where the attention span is not what it should be, then I think we really have a big problem on our hands. Now, a lot of this, I must tell you, was discussed, when we took up the presidency. We decided that if we are to be fair to the countries who are not in the room, and it's important to be fair to them because a lot of these countries are the countries who are facing the brunt of the problems that I described to you, that we need to hear them. It should not be our intuitive sense of what they feel. So we actually went through this exercise of what was called Voice of Global South, where 125 countries participated in deliberations in the month of January. So many of the sentiments that I expressed to you, the assessments that I share, the concerns that I convey, these are not just our own. These are the distilled essence of what 125 countries today, at least 125, feel about the state of the world. Now, we are now chronologically significantly down the way where the G20 is concerned. A lot of the ministerials have taken place. Some of the important ministerials still, some of them have happened. Some have more rounds to go. And in a way, you could say the jury is still out. We've had some achievements. We've still had a lot of work in progress. There is some which we hope will progress. But I would certainly flag the development ministers meeting, partly, of course, because I happen to chair it, but the fact that we were able to get a consensus around the idea of a sustainable lifestyle, that we were able to get really a full focus on the challenges today that SDG realization is facing. We sought to put women-led development more strongly on the table. And of course, one of the perennial issues, but which another track was looking at, and as I said, that's still work under progress, is in regard to multilateral development bank reform. In all of this, of course, there is also the issue of whether we can come up with a credible form of green financing. I think it's something which goes to multiple tracks out here. But I would really conclude by stressing that, it's important for the G20 to realize that what unites us today is more than what separates us. I'm not in denial of the fact that there are deep differences within the G20. But I do believe that there's a larger agenda to humanity, a larger agenda for the planet. And it's therefore absolutely vital that we find a common landing point when the summit takes place in September. We hope for a very substantive and for a very impactful summit. And in a way, your own experience would have showed you, we have tried to do in India the G20 a little bit differently. We have tried to make this much more connected with the people. We want our society really to use the G20 experience to become more global, to understand that the problems of the world in some ways are really indivisible. And at the same time, it's our endeavor also to ensure that, all those who come to India from G20, from the guest countries, from the international organizations, from other countries, that they have an opportunity to see the changes in India. Because for us, it's really been a truly transformational decade. I mean, the India that you see in 2023 is a very different India than what it was in 2014. And I hope that that's a takeaway that you will carry back in your baggage. So our effort is really to use the G20 to make the world ready for India and India ready for the world. But once again, I'm so happy to see you all, even if it is at a distance. Delighted to interact with you today, and I'm looking forward to the session. Thank you.
Mr. Foreign Minister, I'm going to pick up something that you said in your remarks. Some successes, some difficulties. You are very cryptic. What keeps you up at night? We are 5 weeks away. What keeps you up at night in terms of the progress of the presidency? I'm sure there's something that's troubling you. That's why you're not here with us.
No, I'm not here with you only because I have a parliamentary duty. Otherwise, a T20 would have been irresistible. So there are, I assure you, no other problems other than the intricacies of Indian politics and Indian parliamentary democracy here. But your question, what keeps me awake at night? Look, I'm of course tempted to give you a very flippant answer, that it's a mix of coffee and jet lag. But a serious answer would be that there are actually today, the more any of us travel around in the world, and the more, if your travels are sufficiently diverse, when we encounter societies where we can see today that their basic development has slowed up in the last few years, that, education, health, employment, all these are under stress. When we see the ravages of COVID, because COVID has been so massively scarring that it's really going to take us, it's going to take us years to come out of it fully, even materially, leave alone psychologically. So I would say, these multiple shocks which have come one on top of another, and the way the social fabric of societies are under stress, I think that worries me. It worries me because it will throw up challenges, it'll throw up challenges in politics, it'll throw up challenges systemically, and it's something which really we need to pay attention, and I fear we're not doing that. And that's really one of the things which worries me.
Mr. Minister, you also mentioned in your address to us on peace and security. You spoke about peace and security, and you clearly did in some ways posit the role and objectives and missions of the G20 against those of other institutions. My question to you would be, has the European conflict changed the G20 forever? Is it going to fundamentally alter the mission, the design, and perhaps even the reason of existence of this grouping based on what has happened and unfolded in the last 14 months or so?
Well, look, I want you to kind of roll this film back a bit, okay? Go back to 2008, 2009. The G20 started with a very narrow mandate. We were really in the midst of an enormous financial crisis. Question was, how do we deal with it? And then if you see year after year, one more layer was added on, something else came on, health came on, SDGs came on. So bit by bit, the G20 mandate has really brought it. It still stayed broadly within development and growth, but the mandate has brought it. Now, if you ask me, I mean, you mentioned Europe and you mentioned the conflict, okay, the Ukraine conflict. Look, I would in no way minimize the conflict or indeed underplay its implications for the international community. In fact, for the global order, in a way. I quite get it. My point would be that the G20 will have to take that into account. I don't think the G20 cannot be impervious to what is happening in the world. Okay, yeah, it cannot take a bureaucratic view, but the G20 still has a fundamental remit. And if you look at the fundamental remit, and I give you this as an example, I mean, to me, if you look at the COVID, I mean, the COVID, I mean, when they say it's once in a century, I mean, they're not, don't take that literally. It is actually a once in a century event. It's been so catastrophic in a way. So, what I sense is that the G20, like any other grouping, will absorb the big global developments of its time, and there will not be a single one. There will be multiple ones, and with each one, the G20 will adjust. It will mutate. It will improvise, and that's what actually we are seeing. So it's not like we have a single problem and a single consequence. I think we have multiple problems, and we have really serious multiple problems, and it's for the G20 to, in a sense, capture the entirety of what is happening in the world. So and then see, okay, what is the best contribution it could make in that situation.
Dr. Jaishankar, you did mention in your remarks, and I've noted it down, that the voice of the Global South Summit, the effort to listen to 125 countries. But it is also true, sir, that many say that you have spent more time in the African continent than you have at South Block in New Delhi. The Prime Minister has made this a central theme of India's foreign policy. But in concrete terms, what is the new future that your engagement with the continent, Prime Minister's ambition with the continent, can architect with the G20 for the future?
Well, I am tempted to tell you they don't call South Block for nothing. So there's a natural proclivity to look south. But having said that, look, one of the reasons why I've actually been visiting a lot of my counterparts in Africa is that we do believe that these multiple shocks which are described, if there's any geography which has really taken a hit as a consequence, everybody took a hit, but I think Africa took the hardest hit. And I think in fairness, it's important for the world today to recognize that. Secondly, it so happens, because that's the way the G20 ranking was in that particular year, the presence of Africa in the G20 itself is very limited. So we felt very strongly that it was important for Africa to have a stronger voice, a bigger presence in the G20. And indeed, that's one of the issues that we are vigorously championing. Our Prime Minister feels very strongly that the African Union must have a permanent membership of the G20, and we are in the process of eliciting a consensus from the other member states of the G20. But Africa is also the continent of promise. Now, if you look at what Africa has got going for it, I mean, it has got the demographics, it has got the resources, it has got the talent, it has got the location. But unless we fix today, it's really, I would say, almost hypocritical to talk about tomorrow. So we need today to focus on Africa, and and frankly on the rest of the global south as well, but particularly in Africa, if we are actually to ensure a broad-based recovery. It should not be that after these shocks, the recovery then is so uneven that there are parts of the world which come out of it and say, okay, I'm good, and there are parts of the world who are still struggling, but their voice is not heard. So it's, my visits are partly meant to highlight really how strongly we feel about Africa, why it's important to put African issues today on the G20 table, why it's necessary to have an African presence on the G20. So that's the answer.
Mr. Minister, I'm going to turn the job of asking questions to you, to my colleagues in the T20. And I'm going to start putting together a list that comprises of past leadership of the T20 as well as ones coming ahead. And of course, we are going to throw in a bit of G7 into it so that we are seen to be inclusive. So I'm going to also bring in Dean Sonobe from Japan. But let me first turn to Professor Bambang. He chaired the Indonesian T20. And Professor, can you take the mic and pose your question to the Honorable Minister?
Minister Jaishankar, thank you very much for your very crystal clear explanation about the G20. I'm wondering, in your opinion, whether G20 will be like the best forum to convey the voice of Global South compared with, for example, the UN system or with the international financial system, including multilateral development bank. And one more question, very straightforward question. I'd like to know latest India position regarding non-aligned movement that, Indonesia and India were initiator in the past, in the middle of this complicated geopolitical tension. Thank you very much.
So we will possibly take them one at a time so you can respond to this and we'll proceed to the next one after this.
Okay. Professor, I would not see this as an either or. Okay. I think the voice of the Global South must be heard by G20 because G20 is the most influential grouping of countries today in the international community. They are the top 20 economies. So say what you will, these 20 countries have a weight and an influence and an ability to shape the international order like nobody else does. So it's absolutely essential that they hear the pain of the Global South. Now, that doesn't mean because we are talking in the G20 that we don't make this felt in the UN processes and gatherings. For example, when we did the G20 Development Ministers meeting, and then we will do the summit thereafter, our expectation is whatever we've been able to get consensus on in respect of the SDG, and clearly the SDG today needs more resources. We would like that to feed into the SDG summit. So to me, the UN, the G20, the international financial institutions, they may be separate, but they are all deeply interlinked, and certainly interlinked in terms of the membership and in terms of the of the networking of the real economies. Again, I'll make one important point here, and this is a political point, but I'm sure it'll resonate with those of you who are connected to the world of politics. Look, for us, the world is not just about strategy and calculation and competition. We have today in India a government, my government of which I'm a minister, led by Prime Minister Modi, which believes in an inclusive society. An inclusive society means we will all progress only when we ensure that there's really nobody left behind. Now, if I truly believe in inclusion, I cannot have a domestic inclusion and not extrapolate it out in the world. To me, what I'm doing with Voice of Global South is actually a direct extrapolation of what I'm doing in India for the vulnerable sections of our population. And I think this logic resonates with a lot of countries, including a lot of members of the G20. Your other question about the non-aligned. I do think that the world values and should continue to value the independent opinions. Definitely we have an interest, in what has been going on for many, many decades. But it's also important that as it stands, the non-aligned movement and its gatherings actually take an objective position, that they're not manipulated by non-members, that they actually stand up for what is right, that they respect regional views of their own membership. I think that's something which is very important. But I can assure you that we will be very much interested in maintaining and strengthening the non-aligned process, because today we believe a multipolar world actually has a greater value to independent voices than the Cold War era.
Let me now turn to Dr. Luciana Serbo, President of IPIA, and she's going to be in the leadership of the next T20 process. So Luciana, can I turn to you?
Your Excellency, Dr. Shankar, it's an honor to be here talking to you. I want to know how you value the contributions that were handed to you by the T20 partners, how useful it is for the process of decision-making of G20. And also, what's your message for Brazil next year in the continuity of this contribution of the think tanks? Thank you very much.
So that even I would like to know, do you value what we sent to you? That's a fair question.
I think it's a fair question, and I'll give you a fair answer. To some extent, the G20 has developed, to my mind, an open architecture. The fact that you have so many meetings of so many different facets of government and civil society itself is a testimony to the fact that it's not something which is run by a narrow set of policy makers. I think the whole philosophy and outlook of the G20 is, listen to the world, listen to the society, listen to the people. And certainly, where India is concerned, that's particularly how we've tried to run it. And I can assure you that, with every meeting, the feedback that we get is something which goes into our own G20 system. And I have every confidence that in some form or the other, it will form part of a mosaic which will emerge out of the G20 summit. Regarding the role of partners, within the G20, obviously we try to work as cohesively as possible. We do listen very respectfully to the guests, because that's the whole purpose of calling them. But the G20 has always had a tradition where the Troika is particularly close. And I can assure you that in all the meetings that I have had and my ministerial colleagues have had, we do not make there's nothing we really do without taking the Troika on board. In my own case, whether it's Minister Mauro Vieira or Minister Retno Marsudi, we are constantly talking to each other, even at the meetings. How the meeting flows, what do we do? All this is something we take really together as a trio.
Dr. Jaishankar, there was also a request for any inputs for Brazilian presidency. Do you have any suggestions for the presidency coming up?
Well, I think that would be both premature of me, because I need to first, get through our own. And then I would say it's something which each one of us partly has to discover for themselves. But, the whole idea of a troika is actually you partly share the experience of your predecessor. So I wouldn't give advice. I would only say that I'm sharing fully and wholeheartedly everything that I'm going through with my Brazilian colleagues.
Excellent. Let me, there's a good time to bring in South Africa. So let me bring in Elizabeth Sitrapolis, Chief Executive, South African Institute of International Affairs. Elizabeth, over to you.
Good evening, Minister. It's a great honor and a great pleasure to be engaging with you. And I've read your book, India Way, and I enjoyed it very much. I think you've spoken a lot about the failing multilateral system, and I thought particularly the point you made about the G20 really carrying a lot of the burden and responsibility around development and growth is particularly relevant. So South Africa this year, of course, is, as you know, chairing the BRICS. In 2 years, we'll be chairing the G20. These are informal formations that are playing a really important role at the global level. What specific role do you see them playing in terms of resuscitating the formal multilateral system? And could that, the role that clubs play, that informal groupings play, would that strengthen it, or would that actually undermine the formal multilateral system? And I think in the context of the discussion around BRICS expansion, I think that's also relevant. And then one last question about the AU. We're very glad that the Indian presidency obviously took the initiative to invite the African Union. But does that open the way for other regional organizations perhaps to want to make the case to join? And how does that change then the way in which the G20 operates and is structured, intergovernmental organizations?
That's a lot of questions you have in there packed into a short one. I just wanted to make sure I understood that your first point, which was that if you have G20 and BRICS and other such plurilateral organizations, what does it do to formal multilateralism? Did I understand that right?
Correct.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Look, I think it's good for formal multilateralism, but I think it will not solve the problems of formal multilateralism. What we are facing in the multilateral world is really a very anachronistic system. We are facing an anachronistic system where it's not just age. I'm getting on in life myself, so I don't ever throw age anymore at people. But the fact is, if you have, Asia and Latin America absent from the deciders of the world, if you have the most populous country not there in the world, if you have among the top economies of the world, many of them missing from the leadership of the UN, I think it is clearly to the detriment of the UN. And it appears that those who are today occupying that space seem more concerned about preserving their prerogatives than frankly addressing the credibility and welfare of the organization of which they have actually been given the responsibility to lead. And that's a really sad state of affairs. But what therefore to my mind will happen is actually the more the formal multilateral system fails us, because I have to use that term unfortunately, the more it fails us, it's going to be for the rest of the world to pick up the slack. So it could be the G20, as you say, it could be the BRICS, it could be the Quad, it could be something else. Whether it's good or bad, we don't know. But the fact is, it's for real. I hope that all of this puts pressure on the formal system to reform, because we genuinely believe that the overwhelming majority of members of the UN today want to see change. And it's a very small group of countries who do not want to do that and who, in a sense, are manipulating the system to their end. Now, in terms of the possible permanent presence of the EU, bear in mind the European Union is already there. So it's not like conceptually this is completely sort of different from the norms of the G20. I think the thought is really we need to have more Africa present on the table. We need to have more Africa present because, as I said, that is where today the greatest worries are, but that is where the greatest promises. And for one to become the other, we need to have them on the table.
Since we discussed the multilateral system, let me now invite Maria Fernanda Espinosa, formerly the president of the 73rd session of the General Assembly of the UN. Ma'am, the more the system fails us, the more we will find other solutions. Question to you.
Well, Honorable Minister, it's music to my ears as former president of the UN General Assembly to hear from you that the multilateral system, the United Nations, needs profound retooling, and I cannot agree more with you. But I need to thank India for putting women at the center of your presidency through establishing women-led development as one of your priorities. And basically, we said earlier here that all issues are women's issues. So my question to you is, how do you see the contribution of women when we are redesigning the international financial architecture, the multilateral banks, the role and the contribution of women as we shape just and fair transitions to net zero and climate stabilization? And I think that you have made that very clear by saying it is not women and development or development for women, but women-led development where they're not vulnerable beneficiaries, but they are agents of transformation and change. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm glad you asked that question because in many ways it's also something which for us is a big domestic debate and I would say focus in a way. Why do we use the term women-led development? Partly because this is something which our Prime Minister in particular has repeatedly emphasized. If you look actually at the place of women in society, the place of women in family, women in many ways are actually extraordinarily influential. They are the glue that holds a family together. They are the glue that holds communities together. That they're imbued with a sense of responsibility. I mean, if you look at any difficult situation, think each one of us thinks about our personal lives and personal experiences. It is the women in our family who would actually, in a sense, take it upon themselves. And if somebody has to absorb the cost of it, they are the people who normally step forward. So today, how do we actually give them that due weight, the due place, listen to their views, look at their perspective, encourage their contribution, And the second point you made really, you spoke about international organizations, but I would say generically it is actually a larger issue of women in workplace and women in leadership positions in workplace. So this is something which certainly is a very, it's really a subject of great attention today, great focus today in India. And if you look at our own programs, whether it was, we have a program about educating girls. The entire toilet program was actually focused on ensuring there was toilet for girls so that there was then a willingness to send girls to school. Then you came, in fact, pretty much every program in some way eventually leads back to women. Because we found we have today a big water, providing waters to houses program. Now, it directly impinges girls because if you don't supply water to a household will typically send a girl out to get water. They will not send a boy out to get water. So in different ways, every social program in some way or the other feeds back into the well-being of women. And one of the big achievements for us in the last decade has really been how much improvement there has been in the gender balance in this country. So you've come absolutely to the right place, the right country under the right leadership to talk about women-led development. It is something, our heart is on in this issue, and certainly we would like to see that get, a much stronger play when the summit happens.
I know we are absolutely out of time, but I'll request you for a few more minutes, Minister. I want to bring in Dean Tetsushi Sonobe. He leads the Asian Development Bank Institute, was the chair of Think 7 Japan, and is someone who has who's determined to make Think 7 a forum for the world and not only for the G7. So, Dean Sonobe, over to you.
Thank you, Samir. Your Excellency, it's a really great honor to ask you a question, and thank you very much for deeply insightful remarks. And one of the remarks was about G20, G7 relationship. And in relation to that, I'd like to ask this question. So what would be your advice to the G7 leaders if they were wondering what they could do to make G20 or G20 plus G7 combined function better to the world?
Is it time to end the G7, sir?
Sorry?
Is it time to end the G7? I think that's what he's implying here. He can't say it because he's the chair of the T7.
No, first of all, I must say I didn't need to give advice because I just had Foreign Minister Hayashi here. So we were, he's the Foreign Minister of the country, which is currently the chair of the G7. So we had a discussion on the G7, G20, but my own Prime Minister was there at the G7 meeting in Hiroshima as well. Look, the G7 is the G7. Okay, it has its own history, it has its own culture, it has its own previous connections, it has its collective interest. I mean, they are entitled to have that. The point is the world has moved on, and I credit G7 itself for recognizing that the world has moved on, which is why today the G7 is such a willing partner of the G20. So the point I would say right now is it's important for the G7 to recognize that, as I said, that we have a double crisis, that it's not only an East-West issue, there's a North-South issue, and it's important, therefore, to pay attention to both of them and to harmonize these issues. One, any progress on one should not have to come at the cost of the other. And certainly, when I look today at the key issues for the G20, if you are looking at SDGs, if you are looking at climate action, if you are looking at energy security, at food security, these problems cannot be solved without the cooperation of the G7. So we would like the G7 to fully, completely, wholeheartedly contribute to the success of the G20. I mean, they're just not members. Many of them are particularly influential and powerful members. So we would want them to be very much into it. To me, look, as I said, there are different phases of the global order. They happen to coexist. I would not make it an either or. To me, how do we carry everybody, the internal unity of G20, finding a landing ground, developing an actionable consensus? This, to me, is what should be the goal in September. That's what we are striving towards. And I have every confidence, particularly with Japan as the chair of the G7, I have every confidence that we'll get the fullest support of the G7.
Mr. Minister, let me thank you on behalf of all of us for your time this evening. I had advised Ambassador Chinoy that if we had chosen our logo as a cricket bat, there would be a greater chance of a lot more people visiting us in our events. So maybe we should have had a more creative logo. But I hope that in the next 4 months, we have an opportunity, some of us in this room, because we are planning to do some more gatherings to take forward and disseminate some of what we agreed to in September. And we have an opportunity to meet you. because not being able to take a selfie with you is depriving us of our most popular Instagram post. And that is something that we've been denied this time. But thank you so much for your time, sir, and for answering all the questions with your typical eloquence and forthrightness. And I hope we'll have an opportunity to see you soon. From all of us here, thank you very much. Please join me in applauding the Minister for his wonderful show. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.